that, Phil. We could divide ethics into two broad areas. The first is, what is the right thing to do? And then the second is, once we work that out, how do we get people to do it? And I think even in this room, with a very diverse group of people, we could form a kind of rough consensus on the first. A kind of general agreement among us that, well, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't cheat, you shouldn't steal, you shouldn't kill. You know, a lot of guys, unless they need killing. So let's assume we have a rough consensus on what good is. What I'd like to talk about tonight is not the what, but the how. How do we get people to behave this way? Benjamin Franklin knew how, or thought he did. Do you know Benjamin Franklin? In America, we regard him as one of our founding fathers. He was quite the inventor. He invented bifocals. He was a kind of social planner. Benjamin Franklin started the first volunteer fire department in the United States. Here's something else he did. In 1728, when he was a young man, he was just 22. Well, here's how he describes it in his autobiography. It was about this time I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection. I wished to live without committing any fault at any time. As I knew or thought I knew what was right and wrong, I did not see why I might not always do the one and avoid the other. Now, Franklin was a very practical guy. And so the first thing he did was what we did. We worked out, well, what is the good? What is the right thing? And he made a list of 13 virtues, what goodness was to Franklin, and wrote a little precept, a little sentence besides each one to remind him. Number one was temperance. Franklin wrote, eat not to dullness, drink not to elevation. Note that he's not preaching abstemiousness, just moderation. He liked a good dinner and he liked a good bottle of wine. Number two, silence. Speak not but what may benefit others or yourself. Avoid trifling conversations. It's like what our parents taught us, if you can't say anything nice. Then came order, resolution, frugality, industry, sincerity, justice, and moderation. Number 10, cleanliness. Tolerate no uncleanliness in body, clothes, or habitation. It's interesting that he saw this as a moral attribute and not as a dry cleaning problem. Number 11, tranquility. Number 12, chastity. Rarely use venery, sex, but for health or offspring. Never to dullness, weakness, or the injury of your own or another's peace or reputation. Well, that's not chastity at all. Franklin is very pro-sex, even quite late in his life, as the French discovered, and quite liked it, by the way. But what Franklin has here, I think, in one sentence, is a kind of guide to having an honorable sex life. Don't do anything that will hurt yourself or the other person. Not a bad way to start. Number 13, the last of Franklin's list of virtues, humility. He wrote, imitate Jesus and Socrates, two guys you don't think of as hanging out together all that much. So he's got his list of the 13 virtues, what goodness is. Then he thought it was just a matter of practice and spreadsheets, or the 18th century equivalent of spreadsheets. Franklin's job for most of his life was a printer, and he used the most advanced 18th century technology. He made himself a little leather notebook, and in this notebook he ruled a grid. Lines this way, lines this way. Down this column, he wrote the 13 virtues, and across the top, he wrote the days of the week. And he was then going to practice the virtue of the week plan, that every week he'd concentrate on only one virtue. He wouldn't even think about the others. And each time he failed, if he was working on frugality, when he failed to be frugal, he'd give himself a little check mark. And he hoped that by the end of the week, there'd be fewer and fewer check marks. And by Sunday, he'd be perfect. He'd be frugal, on to number 2. 13 weeks, he'd be perfect. So he sets out on this plan. And in 6 weeks, he reached virtue number 6, industry. Lose no time. Be always employed in something useful. Cut off all unnecessary actions. That's when he abandoned the entire project. Franklin writes, again in the autobiography, I soon found that I had undertaken a task of more difficulty than I had imagined. Well, yeah, but not for lack of effort or industry. He was an incredibly hardworking and disciplined guy. I believe Franklin failed to achieve moral perfection because he took fundamentally the wrong approach. That he believed in order to be good, he had to change his character. And that's how many philosophers approach the question of virtue, by emphasizing character. Aristotle talks about how can we create the virtuous man, by which he meant a person who you could put him in any situation and he would still do the right thing. So strong was this character we'd cultivated in him. Over the 10 years that I've been writing the ethics column for the Times, I've come to believe that character hardly comes into it at all. Indeed, I've come to think there may not even be such a thing as character, that it's circumstances, community, the conditions in which we act that most shape our behavior. And that's by far the biggest change in my thinking over those years. I can tell you a few smaller ways in which I've changed from having this job. When I go to a party now, the fun stops the minute I arrive. There's this feeling that incredibly depraved things have been going on, but then he gets here and everyone must stop. It's awful. The other thing that happens is when I do get inside, people will take me aside and ask me ethical questions. And the only question I have is, where's the bar? Where's the liquor? And this may happen to many of you in other situations, that you're trying to have a social evening and people are asking you a professional question. I never knew how to handle it until I asked a doctor friend of mine, and she gets asked medical questions at parties all the time, and she taught me 2 sentences, and it works for any job, so you can all use it. This is my gift to you. If someone asks you a professional question in a social setting, you just say what she says. Take off your clothes and hop up on the table, and I'll sort you right out. I'll tell you a way in which having my cushy job has not changed me. It hasn't made me behave even slightly better. I'm no more virtuous now than I was 10 years ago, and I don't have to be. It's in my contract. I'm not, well, or it should be, that I'm not hired to be a role model for the kids. I'm not hired to personify virtue. I'm hired to write about these questions of right and wrong in a way that readers find interesting. I don't know if you've met a lot of sports writers, but there's not 1 in 50 of them that can hit the fastball. And why should they? They're not hired to be athletes. They're hired to write about athletes in a way that's entertaining to their readers. And that's the self-serving rationalization I use, even when the cops drag me off. What it does do when you spend your working day thinking about such things is it makes you enormously conscious of all the ways your own behavior has fallen short, all the ways in which you fail to achieve moral perfection. It is so depressing. It is so demoralizing. I'm pretty sure it qualifies me for some kind of workers' comp. Well, back to, enough about my favorite subject, me, and back to this question of character or circumstances. And here's my argument. If we want to be good, if we want to persuade other people to be good, we should realize there are conditions under which people tend to act very, very well, and conditions under which they tend to act quite badly. This is not to deprecate the importance of individual choice or responsibility, but it is to say it's really hard to drive at 65 when people are whipping by you at 90. But if you create the right conditions, it's quite impressive how people will act. Let me give you some examples. In New York, where I live, not so far, at the corner of 33rd and Broadway, it's a big transportation hub. Many commuter trains come into Penn Station there, and there are thousands of people pouring out in the street. That's where many subways stop, and people are pouring out. That's where Madison Square Garden is there, a big sports arena. And you'll see after a game, thousands of people pouring out of a basketball game, having just watched the Knicks. They're generally weeping openly. And what all these people want at that moment more than anything is a taxi. The most horrible acts of violence I've seen in my 30 years living in New York have been committed in pursuit of that goal, and often one relative against another. It's out of my way, Granny, I am going home. About 20 years ago, someone did something very, very simple, presumably the Taxi and Limousine Commission. They painted a yellow line down the sidewalk and wrote 2 words next to it, cab line. This utterly transformed human behavior. Now, nearly everyone, nearly all the time, waits in that line. This is not enforced in any way. There are no taxi cab police. But simply by putting a little bit of paint on the street, it changed people's conduct. If you believe there's such a thing as character, it should be sturdier than what a stripe of yellow paint will change. The dog law in New York is a similar thing. When I first moved to New York, there was no law requiring anyone to pick up after their dogs, and no one did. Our streets were just lined with dog shit. It was hideous. It was medieval. There was this walk New Yorkers had where they were leaping sideways over the dog waste. Well, 35 years ago, we got a law that said you must pick up after your own dog. We should build a monument to this law. It would be a disgusting monument, I grant you that, but it would testify to something noble in the human spirit, that by making a small change in just our social assumptions, hey, we're all going to pick up after our dogs now, nearly everyone, nearly all the time, picks up after their dog. Now, it's, again, like the cab line, it's not enforced. The cops rarely give tickets out for this. It's the same people who didn't used to pick up before. It's the same dogs. So even if some incredibly noble dog, some saint of the dog world came along, what can it do? No opposable thumb. But by just changing a simple social assumption, it completely changed the way people behave. Plagiarism in high school seems another example of this to me. When I went to high school, nobody cheated. All right, nearly nobody cheated. There were two kids who cheated. We all knew who they were, and we all looked down on them, not because they were committing a moral offense, but because they were stupid. We felt they cheated because they had to, and we looked at them as inferior. Children are very cruel. I'm sorry. If either of those kids are here, I'm sorry. I'm sorry I was mean. 5 years ago, my daughter graduated from what I think is the best public high school in New York City. It's a place called Stuyvesant. She and her classmates were smarter than my friends and me. They were harder working. They were more sophisticated. And every single one of them, without exception, was a cheater. Well, all right, one exception. My daughter never cheated, so she says. Now, and they cheat brilliantly. These are brilliant kids. They're doing things with microprinting on pencils. They're doing things with RF transmitters. These are the greatest cheaters I have ever seen, but they're cheaters. Now, if you think it's because they have bad characters, that's what shapes their conduct, you have to believe a couple of things. First, you have to believe that the New York Board of Education somehow managed to gather together the most wicked, evil children in New York and put them in one school. What you also would look for is, well, if all these evil kids have been put in one school, their evil, wicked characters should show up in other places. They should be stealing from all the stores in the neighborhood. The basketball team should be regularly cheating. The debate team should be, however, if a debate team can cheat, they should be cheating. Well, of course, none of this happens. The Stuyvesant kids behave about the same as any other kids in New York. So it seems to me they don't have evil characters, which then kind of shifts the burden to me. Well, if it's not their characters, how have circumstances changed? How is it different for them than when I was in high school? And I can give you one example that when kids in my class had to write a report, we went to a physical place called the library. The older people can explain to the younger people what that is. And you would go there, and a reference librarian would give you some advice, and you would tell her your topic. It was always she in those days. This was a job always held by women then. And she would say, oh, here's your topic. Here are the names of some books you should look at, and you'd write them down. And then you'd go to the card catalog, and you'd get more information. You'd look it up, and you'd go to the stacks, pull down the books, look for information that was useful to you, and write it out. When you got home and had to now write your report, you had already written down all your sources. It was built into your research method. It was a very easy thing to cite your sources. When my daughter and her friends do research for a paper, they do it all online, and they just cut and paste. There's nothing built into that requires you to write down the name of the author, and they often don't. This doesn't justify what they're doing, but I think it shows a way in which the conditions in which they do research have changed, and their behavior has changed. I'll give you another example. At the University of Newcastle upon Tyne in England, in the psychology department, there's a break room. And the break room is a place where you can go and make yourself a cup of coffee, a cup of tea, and on the wall of the break room is a little price list, a little menu. It's just a simple piece of paper, and it says, this is how much it costs for coffee, how much it costs for tea, and on that table there's something called the honesty box. And what you're meant to do is to put a little bit of money in to pay for your coffee. This system was in place for 10 years, so everyone is quite familiar with it. And then a member of the department named Melissa Bateson did something very, very simple. She changed the sign on the wall. And what she did was put a little border around the sign. And she would change it at random from week to week. Some weeks it was just a little border of flowers. One week roses, one week daisies. Nothing complicated, just something you could do on your Macintosh computer at home. On alternate weeks, there was a different little border. It was eyes. And sometimes it was bespectacled eyes like mine. Sometimes it was very glamorous fashion model eyes. And she would change it, flowers, eyes, from week to week. On the weeks when the border around the menu was eyes, there was 3 times as much money in the honesty box. Melissa Bateson, who constructed this experiment, offers an explanation for why. She wrote, "Models suggest that if you know you're being watched, then for the sake of your reputation, it will pay you to behave more altruistically. All we have done is take advantage of the natural response people have to eyes to manipulate their perception of being watched." We're very good at spotting eyes, whether they're there or not. If you're a little mammal and you live out on the savannah and you might be attacked by predators, the ability to see 2 dots as eyes, that's a very useful thing. Also, evolutionary biologists have noticed that people are likelier to be generous when they can advertise their good deeds, that I'll give food to you because all of you can see it, and then when I need food, I hope you'll give food back to me. Bateson's explanation, it seems to me, says it is just a simple change in circumstances that produces a big change in behavior. One last experiment, and this one is about our willingness to render aid to other people. And it was conducted, by the way, by social psychologists, not moral philosophers. A great thing about the life of the philosopher is no lab work. You can assert anything, and you don't have to prove this is actually how people behave. Social psychologists have to actually go out and construct the experiment. So here's how this works. This was set up in a shopping mall. And back here, there's a payphone, so it was a while ago. A random passerby, not involved in the experiment, is talking on the phone. As soon as the person hangs up the phone, someone in the experiment is going to walk by, and she's going to have a briefcase. And when the phone is hung up, she's going to hit a switch on her briefcase. It's going to pop open. All her papers will spill out on the floor. Here's what they're looking for. Will the guy who hangs up the phone help her pick up her papers? Now, they build in a variable. At random, half the time when the phone is hung up, a free coin drops into the coin return. Half the time, not. When the person hanging up the phone got the free coin, 87% of them helped the woman pick up her papers. When there was no coin, only 4% helped her pick up her papers. If there's such a thing as character, it can't change for 1 peso. It has to be more durable. It seems to me, then, the only conclusion we can reasonably draw is that our willingness to be good, if we want people to be good, the way to do this is to not try to change their character. We don't know about character, but to try to change their circumstances. And that's where we began. Remember, the question was, how to be good? How do we get people to be good? It seems to me the answer is live in a good neighborhood. And I think this is good news. I think this is a cause for optimism, because we don't know how to improve character, but we do know something about building better communities. Now, the other thing to bear in mind is this does not get you off the hook morally. It puts you on a bigger hook, because you can't retreat into this idea of personal virtue, that easy escapism. Seeing good conduct, seeing ethics as a function of community, compels us to see ourselves as members of that community with common problems and reciprocal obligations to the other members of the community. And so, if we believe that virtue will only function in a just society, it becomes our moral obligation to work to build a just society. Thank you very much.